The city at 2 in the morning belongs to nobody and everybody at once. The streets are wide and empty, slicked dark with rain that hasn't stopped since before sunset, and the orange halos of the street lamps sit low in the mist like lanterns abandoned at sea. Daniel Mercer knew this city and its night hours better than most men knew the faces of their neighbors. He had walked these blocks for 6 years now, the route from the warehousing complex on Aldrich Street to his apartment on Cassidy Lane, and he could have traced the cracks in every sidewalk square from memory. Tonight he was later than usual. The loading bay on the 4th floor had flooded again, a pipe in the utility corridor having split at its seam sometime around midnight, and Daniel had spent the last 2 hours with a mop and a wet vac, and the particular kind of patience that the job required of him. He was 34 years old, and he carried himself like a man who had learned not to be angry at things that couldn't hear him. He mopped. He absorbed the water. He left the floor clean. His jacket was still damp when he reached Aldrich Bridge. It was a modest thing, iron rail, concrete deck. The sort of bridge a city builds not for beauty, but for the functional necessity of getting from one bank to another. The river below was high from the rain, moving faster than it ought. Dark as ink. Daniel paused at the midpoint, out of habit. He did this most nights. Not from any romantic impulse, just because this was where the city opened up a little, and the air felt less like a building pressing down on you. That was when he saw her. She was standing at the railing on the far side of the pedestrian walkway, her back to the street, both hands resting on the iron bar. She was wearing a pale coat, expensive-looking even from this distance, and her dark hair was flattened against her skull from the rain. She had no umbrella. She wasn't moving. She was simply standing there, looking down at the water, and something in the stillness of her posture. Not the stillness of someone admiring a view, but the stillness of someone who had already made a decision, sent a cold thread of recognition through Daniel's chest. He had felt that stillness before. He had sat inside it once himself, in the first winter after his wife died, when Mia was 3 years old and sleeping in the next room, and the world had contracted to a single point of unbearable quiet. He had known then what the edge of a thing felt like. He began walking toward her. Not running might startle her. He kept his steps even. He was still 15 feet away when she leaned forward over the bar, slowly, with the kind of deliberate, exhausted momentum that looks almost peaceful from a distance. And then, she was gone. The sound she made entering the water was swallowed immediately by the rain. Daniel was over the railing before he could think about it. The river hit him like a wall. It was cold, the deep, physical cold of late autumn water that grabs at your joints and your lungs at the same moment, and the current was stronger than it looked from above, pulling at his legs with a steady, indifferent force. He got his bearings, found the pale shape of her coat in the dark water, and swam toward it with everything he had. She wasn't fighting the water. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. He got his arm around her, and she went limp against him. Not struggling, not helping, not resisting, just present in his arms, the way that a person is present when they have decided to stop being responsible for themselves. He hauled her toward the bank, using the current more than fighting it, pulling himself along a rusted drainage grate that jutted from the embankment until his knees found concrete. He got her onto the bank and turned her on her side and waited. She coughed once, twice, and then took a ragged breath that seemed to cost her everything. He pressed his fingers to her throat and found a pulse, faint but steady. He pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance, and then he sat there beside her in the rain, one hand on her shoulder, and looked at her face. She was younger than he'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30. Her cheekbones were sharp, and her skin, even now, even soaked and blue cold, carried the kind of quality that doesn't come from anywhere except money. Her mascara had run in dark streaks below her eyes. She looked, in that moment, less like a person of means, and more like someone who had been crying for a very long time before she ever reached the bridge. The hospital was a 20-minute drive from the bridge. Daniel rode in the ambulance and sat in the emergency waiting room in his wet clothes, shivering under a thermal blanket a nurse had given him with the efficient, absent kindness of someone who gives out blankets many times a night. He had a daughter sleeping in a narrow bed, in a narrow apartment, 6 blocks away, tended tonight by Mrs. Paulson from downstairs. And he had work again, at 7 in the morning. There was no practical reason to stay. He stayed anyway. At around 4 in the morning, a doctor came to tell him the woman was stable, conscious, and asking the nurses not to contact her family. The doctor's name was Dr. Holt, a compact, gray-haired woman with the expression of someone who has seen this particular situation many times and has stopped being surprised by it. She said the patient's name was Evelyn Caldwell. She said Evelyn was refusing a psychiatric evaluation and had been asking for the man who brought her in. Daniel followed Dr. Holt down the corridor and stood in the doorway of the room. Evelyn Caldwell was sitting up in bed with an IV in her left arm and a hospital blanket pulled to her waist. She was looking at the window, a narrow rectangle of black glass reflecting the fluorescent ceiling, and when she heard him enter, she turned. She didn't say thank you. She looked at him for a long moment, the way someone looks at an unexpected variable in an equation they thought they'd already solved, and then she said, "Why did you jump in?" "Because you were drowning," Daniel said. "I know why I was drowning." She said it without hostility. Just as a correction. "I mean, why did you?" "You don't know me." He sat down in the chair beside the bed. Outside, the rain was still going. He could hear it against the window. "No," he said. "I don't." She turned back to the window. A silence passed between them that was not entirely uncomfortable, which surprised him. After a while she said, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone about tonight." "All right," she glanced at him. "You're not going to ask me anything? Do you want me to?" She considered that. "No," she said. "Not tonight." "Then I won't," he said. They sat together in the white-lit room for another hour. Daniel dozed in the chair. When he woke, the chair beside him was empty. The IV line had been disconnected and coiled neatly on the bedside table. The hospital blanket was folded at the foot of the mattress. There was no note. Evelyn Caldwell had simply walked out, sometime in the still hours before dawn, and left nothing behind her. The next 3 days passed the way most days passed for Daniel Mercer, in the rhythm of mop and bucket, of school pickups, and grocery runs, and the particular arithmetic of a life lived on the edge of what was possible. Mia was 7, and already too perceptive for her own good. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and watchful, and she had a way of sitting across from Daniel at dinner and studying him that made him feel, sometimes, that she was the parent and he the child. "You seem far away," she said on the second evening, pushing a piece of broccoli to the edge of her plate. "I'm right here," he said. "Your body's here," she said. "You're thinking about something." He had looked at her and wanted to say something true, and couldn't think of anything that wouldn't either worry her or confuse her. So he said, "I helped someone the other night. I keep wondering if she's okay." Mia considered this seriously. "Did you help her a lot?" "I think so." "Then she's okay," Mia said, with the certainty of a person who has not yet learned that effort and outcome are not always in proportion to each other. On the evening of the third day, Daniel was in the kitchen making pasta, the simple kind, just oil and garlic, and whatever was left in the refrigerator when someone knocked at the door. He wiped his hands on his jeans and went to answer it, and when he opened the door he stood still for a moment and didn't say anything. Evelyn Caldwell was standing in the hallway of his building. She was wearing a dark coat over clothes that looked expensive and out of place in the narrow corridor, with its bare bulb and its smell of old carpet. She was carrying a small rolling suitcase. Her eyes were red around the edges, and her face had the careful, controlled expression of someone who has been crying and has stopped themselves and is using a great deal of energy to hold the stopping in place. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." He had found her address in his coat pocket, a business card that must have fallen from her coat during the ambulance ride. He hadn't looked at it much. He looked at her now, this woman from the bridge, standing in his hallway with a suitcase and apology in her eyes, and he felt the same thing he had felt when he saw her at the railing 3 nights ago, the recognition of someone at the end of something. Behind him, Mia's bare feet padded across the linoleum. She appeared at it. "Come in," Mia said. "We're making pasta." Evelyn looked down at the small hand holding hers, and something passed across her face that Daniel had no name for yet. Her mouth pressed together and her eyes went bright, and she nodded once and let herself be led inside. She stood in the middle of his small, warm kitchen while Mia pulled a chair out for her and Daniel turned back to the stove, and she looked around at the magnetic alphabet letters on the refrigerator and the drawings Mia had made that were taped to the cabinet doors and the stack of library books on the counter. And for the first time since the bridge, she looked like she was present in the room she was actually in. She sat down. Mia brought her a dish towel. "You look cold," Mia said. "This will help." Evelyn pressed the dish towel against her face and cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and completely, the way a person cries when they have been holding it back for so long that the release is indistinguishable from exhaustion. Daniel kept his back to her and stirred the pasta and let her cry without comment, which seemed to be, from the way the sound of it gradually quieted, exactly what she needed. Over the next several days, Daniel learned Evelyn's story in pieces, the way you learn any true story, not all at once, but in the small deposits of conversation that happen over shared meals and in the quiet moments before sleep, when the defenses are lower and the truth is less exhausting to carry alone. Her full name was Evelyn Caldwell Barrett. She was the wife of Preston Barrett, a name that appeared on buildings in this city, on hospital wings and university endowments, and the occasional profile in a business journal. Preston Barrett was 51 years old, extremely wealthy, and regarded in most of the circles he moved in as a man of considerable generosity and charm. His wife had appeared at his side at charity dinners for 5 years with the polished, self-effacing presence of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as is allotted to her. Everyone loved him, Evelyn said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, while Mia did her homework at the other end. That's the part that's hard to explain. It's not like the movies, where the bad guy is obvious. People who met him thought he was wonderful. Sometimes I thought I was the only one who could see the other side of him. And after a while, I started wondering if I'd invented it. You hadn't, Daniel said. No. But I spent a long time not being sure. The control had been the quiet kind. Not violence, not visible cruelty, just a steady, relentless management of her world. Who she saw, where she went, what she wore. The conversations that were redirected when she tried to talk about her own opinions. The subtle social isolation that made her feel, over years, that there was no one she could go to. And then, 2 years ago, a pregnancy that had ended at 4 months, and a grief that Preston had declared should be finished within a suitable period and never discussed again. I think that was when I understood that I'd lost myself, she said. I couldn't grieve on my own schedule. I couldn't grieve in my own way. I couldn't even grieve in my own house. She said all of this without theatrics, which made it harder to hear, not easier. Daniel listened. He didn't offer comparisons or context, or the kind of reassurances that are really just requests for the other person to stop being in pain so that you can stop feeling it with them. He just listened, and when she was done, he said, "Thank you for telling me." She looked at him strangely. "That's what you're going to say? I don't have anything smarter than that," he said. After a moment, she laughed a short, surprised sound, like something she'd forgotten was still in her. "Okay," she said. There were practical complications she hadn't fully considered when she'd arrived at his door with a single suitcase. She had not brought her identification documents. She had not brought her medications. She had been on a low-dose antidepressant for 2 years that Preston had managed, along with everything else, treating the prescription as further evidence of her instability when it suited him, and insisting she continue taking it when stopping might have freed her. She had not brought more than 3 days' worth of clothes. She had, in short, made the decision to leave the way drowning people make decisions, with the most urgent part of herself, and not the part that plans. Daniel drove her to a clinic on the 3rd day to get a temporary prescription filled. He waited outside in his truck for 40 minutes without complaint, reading a paperback he kept in the glove compartment. When she came out and got back in the passenger seat, she looked at the book, Something About Birds, field guide format. The kind of book that suggests a habit of patient attention, and said, "Do you actually go bird watching?" "Mia got interested last spring," he said. "So now I know more about warblers than I ever expected to." She paused. "That's a good kind of father to be." He put the truck in gear. "She picks good interests," he said. "I just follow along." It was a small exchange. She had been in many rooms with many people who commanded much larger ones, who held court at dinner tables, and filled conference calls with authority, and occupied space, as though it were their natural right. But she kept coming back to this one, the truck, the bird book, the admission that the 7-year-old led, and he followed because there was something in it that she hadn't encountered before in quite that form. A man who organized his life around what mattered to someone else, and found this not a sacrifice, but simply the shape of the day. Evelyn had been staying on the fold-out sofa in the living room for 5 days, before she noticed that Daniel slept almost never. He simply kept different hours than she did, but the evidence gradually accumulated. The kitchen light on at midnight when she woke for water, the dark hollows under his eyes that were always there and never seemed worse, which meant they had simply become permanent, the worn patches on the knees of his work pants, the way he ate standing at the counter instead of sitting at the table because sitting down felt, she suspected, too much like stopping. She began, tentatively, to help. She made breakfast before Mia woke up. She learned the route to the school and offered to walk Mia home on the days Daniel was still at work. She cleaned the apartment not in a performative way but in the quiet, methodical way of someone who needed something to do with their hands, and found that making order in a small space was one of the few things that quieted the noise in her own head. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said, coming home one evening to find Mia's laundry folded and stacked on the hallway bench. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." He stood in the hallway in his work clothes, a gray uniform that smelled of industrial cleaner and concrete, and he looked at the neatly folded stack, and something about his expression made Evelyn set down the glass she was holding. "When's the last time someone did something for you?" she said. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "Mrs. Paulson made a casserole after Eleanor died," he said. "Eleanor was my wife. That was 4 years ago." 4 years, she said. She was good at casseroles. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, this man who had jumped into a dark river at 2 in the morning for a stranger, who had sat beside her hospital bed without asking a single intrusive question, who had given her his sofa without hesitation because a 7-year-old had decided that was the right thing to do. He was not a complicated man, she thought, but there was a kind of depth to uncomplicated people that the complicated ones missed entirely. Buried as they were in their own noise, she thought about what she had seen in the kitchen the night she arrived. A photograph on the refrigerator, held up by a magnetic letter E, a woman with a wide smile and Mia's eyes, standing in what looked like a park in summer, her arm around Daniel's shoulders. The photograph was sun-faded at the edges. It had been there a long time. "You still miss her?" Evelyn said. "Yes," he said, without apology or performance. "But you're still here." He seemed to consider whether this was a question. "Mia's still here," he said finally. "That's the same thing, basically." He came on a Tuesday evening, which was somehow worse than if he had come at night, the ordinariness of the hour, the early dusk, the sound of a television in a neighbor's apartment down the hall. Daniel had just gotten home. Mia was on the sofa doing a puzzle. Evelyn was in the kitchen. The knock was deliberate. 3 slow, even beats. Daniel opened the door to find Preston Barrett standing in the hallway with 2 other men, one in a suit, carrying a briefcase, the other larger and watchful, in a way that was not accidental. Preston Barrett was a handsome man of a certain age. Silver hair worn short. Clothes that fit precisely. The bearing of someone accustomed to the situation always arranging itself around him. He looked at Daniel with the measured, curious expression of a man assessing something he expected to be unimpressive. "Mr. Mercer," Preston said. "I understand my wife is here." "She's here," Daniel said. He didn't open the door wider. "I'd like to speak with her." "You can ask her yourself." Preston's expression remained pleasant. The man in the suit opened the briefcase and removed a document. "This is a petition for protective return," the suited man said. "Mrs. Barrett is currently under a mental health evaluation order following her," he paused delicately, "incident. As her husband and legal guardian under the terms of..." "Legal guardian," Daniel repeated. "A precautionary designation, filed last year, in the event of..." "I know what it is," Daniel said. He was aware of Mia behind him. Puzzle abandoned, watching. He was aware of Evelyn in the kitchen. The sounds of her having gone entirely still. He kept his voice even, and his body in the doorway, and looked at Preston Barrett. "She'll need to come out and speak for herself," Daniel said. "I can't tell her what to do. But neither can you. Regardless of what's in that briefcase." Preston's pleasantness developed a new quality beneath its surface. Something that had always been there and was now visible. Like an object you've always lived with suddenly seen in a different light. "You don't understand what you've gotten involved in," Preston said. "Probably not," Daniel agreed. There was a long pause. Then Evelyn appeared beside Daniel in the doorway. She was wearing a plain gray sweater, and her hands were clasped in front of her. Not in supplication, but in the conscious, steadying gesture of someone managing their own fear very carefully. She looked at Preston with the specific, exhausted clarity of a person who has spent a long time seeing someone accurately and finally stopped pretending otherwise. "Preston," she said. "Evelyn, come home." His voice shifted register when he spoke to her softer. The charming register. The one she had once found magnetic. "You're not well. You need—" "I'm not going back," she said. A small sound from the living room. Mia had come to the hallway entrance and was watching Evelyn with the focused attention of a child who understands that the adults are at something important. When Evelyn glanced at her, Mia took 2 steps forward and stood beside her, saying nothing, just standing there. The gesture was so uncalculated, so purely itself, that something shifted in the hallway. Preston looked at the child beside his wife, and his composure showed, very briefly. "It seems. We'll be in touch," the suited man said. They left. Daniel closed the door. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the floor for a moment. And then looked up at Evelyn. "You okay?" he said. "Not entirely," she said. "But more than I was." It was 11 days after the bridge. Mia was asleep. The rain had come back in the night. The same slow gray rain. The city made of soft edges and amber light. Daniel was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. Not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with his hands around the mug. Evelyn sat across from him. She said, "I need to tell you something." "About the bridge." He waited. "I didn't slip," she said. "I know the ambulance report probably said the railing gave way. It didn't. I chose to go over." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You knew?" "I could see it in how you were standing," he said, "and in how you didn't fight the water." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to understand what it was," she said. "It wasn't one bad night. It was more like the accumulated weight of a lot of years that had each been slightly heavier than the one before. Until I was carrying something I couldn't name anymore but couldn't put down. And one night I got to a bridge in the rain and I thought, I can just stop carrying it." "Yes," Daniel said. She looked at him. "You've felt that." "Once," he said. "After Eleanor." "What stopped you?" He turned the coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. "Mia was asleep in the next room," he said. "It was 3 in the morning, and she'd cried for 2 hours that night, which she did most nights that first year. And I'd finally gotten her back down, and I was sitting in the kitchen exactly like this." He paused. "I thought about what she'd wake up to, and that was enough to get me to the morning. And in the morning things were still terrible, but they were terrible in a way that had daylight in it, which is different." Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain said the same thing it always says. "The thing I didn't expect," she said, "was that being pulled out of the water would feel like she stopped." "Like what?" "Like something wanted to keep track of me." She looked at him. "You were a stranger. You didn't owe me anything. You jumped in anyway, and you sat with me in the hospital without asking me to justify myself. And you gave me your sofa. And you made pasta." She smiled slightly. "That sounds absurd when I list it like that." "Little things are allowed to matter," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She had not touched him before, not since the night she arrived when Mia had taken her hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, and he covered them with his other hand, without making anything of it, without turning it into more than it was just 2 people at a kitchen table in the rain, keeping each other located. "I'm sorry I disappeared from the hospital," she said. "You came back," he said. Staying was not a dramatic thing. It was made of ordinary components that accumulated the way all real things accumulate gradually, and mostly without announcement. Evelyn contacted a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Reeves, recommended by Dr. Holt, who specialized in exactly the circumstances Evelyn found herself in. The process of leaving a marriage like hers was long, and not without cost. And Patricia Reeves was clear about both. There would be a period of legal pressure. Preston would dispute the narrative. There would be days when the weight of it felt impossible, but Patricia Reeves had a blunt, compassionate practicality that Evelyn found more useful than any amount of sympathy. And by the end of their first meeting, she had a timeline and a list of actions, and something she had not had for years. a sense of the future as a country with a map. She found work through a contact at an organization that matched people in transitions with administrative positions, nothing that made use of her degree at first, but work with a schedule and a commute, and the particular dignity of earning her own money, which she had not done in 5 years. It paid less than she'd been accustomed to. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that this mattered less than she'd expected. The apartment was still very small. She slept on the fold-out sofa while the legal process ran its course, and the settlement was negotiated, and a place of her own became possible. The sofa was not comfortable. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the couple in the next apartment arguing about something different every night, and the pipes rattled when the heat came on in the mornings. She slept better than she had in years. She understood, gradually, that this was because she was sleeping without the braced alertness that had become, over years of marriage, her resting state, the low-level monitoring for tone of voice, for footsteps on the stairs, for the particular quality of silence that preceded a difficult conversation. She had not known she carried this until she put it down. She had assumed that the way she slept in Preston's house was simply the way adults slept, lightly, tensely, with one part of the mind always keeping watch. It had taken 2 weeks on a fold-out sofa in a cramped apartment that smelled of cooking and laundry to discover otherwise. Mia treated Evelyn's presence with a matter-of-fact warmth that Daniel suspected was his daughter's greatest characteristic, not naive warmth, not performed warmth, but the practical compassion of a child who has lost something major and understands that people need to be held close while they are here. Mia showed Evelyn her drawings, her books, the particular obsession of the month, which in November was volcanoes. Mia explained the difference between shield volcanoes and stratovolcanoes with the focused seriousness of a lecturer, and Evelyn listened with equal seriousness and asked questions, and by the end of the week, Mia had decided that Evelyn was, in her words, scientifically interesting. Highest compliment, Daniel told Evelyn afterward. I gathered, Evelyn said. She also spent time with Mia in the evenings when Daniel was at work, something that happened, the first time, by accident, because Gary the super needed to speak with Daniel about the broken heating unit just as Mia was in the middle of a panic about a school project due the next morning. Evelyn had sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me what the project is supposed to be." And Mia, who had inherited her father's directness, had said, "A poster about a historical figure, but I hate all the historical figures they gave us." And Evelyn had said, "Which ones did they give you?" And Mia had listed them, and Evelyn had said, "What if we approached it from the angle of what they got wrong?" And Mia had said, "We're allowed to do that?" And Evelyn had said, "Let's find out." By the time Daniel came back upstairs, the poster was half finished. Mia was deeply invested in the contrarian argument that her historical figure had been misunderstood by subsequent generations, and Evelyn was at the kitchen counter, making hot chocolate for both of them, with the focused expression of someone who had discovered, perhaps to their own surprise, that they were good at something they hadn't tried before. The poster got a good grade. More importantly, though Mia did not say this directly, Evelyn had become someone Mia trusted with the kind of problem that mattered. There were hard days. Days when the legal proceedings produced new complications and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the morning staring at nothing with her hands wrapped around her mug, and Daniel made breakfast around her and didn't push. Days when she caught herself in a behavior she'd learned inside the marriage, moving through a room as quietly as possible, waiting to be spoken to before speaking, and had to consciously remind herself that the rules of the old place did not apply in the new one. Days when she thought about the bridge and felt, not the attraction she'd felt then, but the memory of it, which was different and which she had learned to acknowledge as something that would stay in the background for a long time, and that she was not required to pretend wasn't there. She had started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Whitmore, recommended by Patricia Reeves, who had an office in a brown brick building on the north side of the city, and a way of asking questions that made you do the answering rather than simply reporting information. Evelyn had been skeptical of therapists, for reasons she recognized, in retrospect, as having been planted there by Preston, who had used the language of mental health as a tool of control for so long that the vocabulary had become contaminated. Dr. Whitmore was methodically, patiently decontaminating it. On those days, she went for long walks in the rain, which she had discovered was her version of what Daniel did with his silence. a way of putting the body in motion when the mind needed to process something it couldn't process sitting still. One Saturday morning in December, Daniel was doing something rare, sitting still. Mia was at a friend's house. The apartment was quiet in the specific way. It was only quiet when Mia was absent, a deeper quiet, a quiet with less texture. He was on the sofa with a cup of coffee and a book he wasn't really reading, and Evelyn was across from him, in the armchair doing something on her laptop related to the legal proceedings. She looked up and said, "Tell me about Eleanor." He closed the book. He looked at the coffee mug. Then he said, "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me." "You never talk about her." "I talk about her with Mia," he said. "Not with anyone else?" He considered. "It's hard to know what to do with it around other people. Some people get uncomfortable, and then I'm managing their discomfort instead of just—" He stopped. "She was funny," he said. "That's what people don't think to ask about. They ask what she died of, how long it took, how Mia is coping. Nobody asks if she was funny. She was very funny. She did this thing where she'd give a running commentary on whatever she was watching, not jokes, exactly, just observations, and somehow they were always the thing you'd been thinking but couldn't articulate. I'd watch a movie with her, and come away thinking, I understood it better than I would have alone." Evelyn was quiet, listening. "She got sick when Mia was 2.5, he said. 14 months. It was long enough to know what was coming, but not long enough to get used to the idea. I don't think you get used to the idea." He looked at the window. "She made me promise to teach Mia to ride a bike. It's a very specific thing to make someone promise. I think she picked it because it was concrete. Because everything else was too large to put into a promise. So I promised. And last spring Mia learned." "Did she know?" Evelyn asked. "That it was the promise? I think so. She's got her mother's way of knowing things without being told." Evelyn looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, the sun-faded one, the woman in the park. She had looked at it many times over the past weeks without acknowledging that she was looking at it. "She would have been good at this," she said. "What you're doing. Being kind to someone you don't know." "She was better at it than me," Daniel said. "I learned from watching her." Evelyn turned back to him. "I don't think you give yourself enough credit." "Maybe not," he said. "And then, because it was the kind of morning that allowed for this. You're different than you were when you arrived." She thought about this seriously. "I'm less frightened," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that. Is that strange for you?" "To watch?" he considered. "No," he said. I don't know. When Eleanor was sick, she had these good stretches, sometimes weeks, where she'd seem like herself again, and the whole weight of it would lift for a while. You'd almost forget, and then it would come back." He looked at her steadily. "With you, it's different. The good stretches keep getting longer. There isn't a coming back." She felt the precision of this, the care he had taken to distinguish the two things, to not conflate them. "That's a kind thing to notice," she said. "I notice things," he said simply. This was, she had come to understand, entirely true. He noticed things the way some people breathed without apparent effort. Without self-congratulation. He noticed when Mia was approaching a difficult day before Mia herself knew it. He noticed when the hot dog vendor on the corner who was usually there wasn't. And mentioned it to her later, as a thing he hoped was fine. He had noticed, on the bridge in the rain, the particular quality of her stillness that distinguished it from the stillness of someone looking at a river. She thought sometimes about the number of people who had passed by the bridge that night. There had been others. She had heard a car, seen the smear of headlights before she stopped seeing anything. Nobody else had stopped. This was not a judgment. It was simply the mathematics of a city at 2 in the morning, when most people are inside or moving fast toward inside, and the cost of stopping is genuinely high. But Daniel Mercer had been neither inside nor moving fast. He had been slow and present in the way of a person who carries their attention with them everywhere and costs themselves nothing by paying it. She didn't say any of this to him. It was enough, for now, to sit in the cold winter light of a Saturday morning and drink coffee and exist in the same room with someone who would notice if she wasn't all right. There was an evening in January, the coldest week of the winter, the kind of cold that makes the city hunch its shoulders and move faster when the heating unit in the apartment gave out around 10 o'clock at night. Daniel assessed the problem, concluded it was the thermocouple, and went downstairs to the super's apartment to ask about an emergency repair. The super, a large, exhausted man named Gary, informed Daniel that the earliest anyone could look at it was morning. Daniel came back upstairs and reported this. They piled every blanket in the apartment onto Mia's bed, and Daniel put 2 pairs of socks on her, and Evelyn read to her until she was asleep. Then they came back to the living room, which was cold enough that their breath was barely visible but present. A thin ghost of warmth in the air. They sat on the sofa, under a blanket each, and didn't say much. The radiator made occasional ticking sounds. Outside, the city was very still. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Yes. What do you think this is?" She made a small gesture that encompassed the sofa, the apartment, the fact of the 2 of them. "You and me. I don't mean I'm not asking you to name it, or commit to anything. I just want to know what you think." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "I think you came to my door because you trusted me. And I let you in because you needed to come in. And somewhere in between all the rest of it." He stopped. "I stopped thinking of you as someone I'd helped. I started thinking of you as someone I wanted to be around." "Yes," she said. "That's what I think too. I'm not quick at this," he said. "I want you to know that. It took me a long time after Eleanor to understand that I was still a person who existed, separate from being a father, and separate from being a widower. I'm still in the middle of working that out." "I know," she said. "I'm in the middle of working out who I am without someone telling me." She paused. "I think that's part of why this works. We're both somewhere in the middle of something. We're not expecting each other to be finished." He turned to look at her. The cold in the room had drawn them slightly closer together on the sofa, not dramatically. Just the small, practical convergence of 2 people sharing warmth. She was looking at him with an expression that he was beginning, finally, to be able to read. Not hope exactly, and not fear, and not the careful blankness she'd worn when she first arrived. Something less defended than any of those things. He said, "I'm glad I stopped on that bridge." She said, "I'm glad you did too." They sat there for a while longer, under their separate blankets in the cold apartment, while outside January pressed its face against the glass, and the city went about its business of being a city at night, the distant sound of a car, a train, the ordinary ongoing life of the world. Eventually they both fell asleep on the sofa, because it was late, and it was cold, and neither of them suggested moving. And when Mia woke up at 6:30 and came out to find them there, she studied the scene for a moment, with her watchful, Eleanor eyes, and then climbed between them, under both blankets, without waking either of them, and went back to sleep. By March, Evelyn had found an apartment 4 blocks away, a small place, 1 bedroom, her own, the first thing she had chosen entirely for herself in 6 years. She picked it because the kitchen window faced east and caught the morning light, and because it was on the 2nd floor, and she could hear the street but not too much of it, and for no other reason than that it pleased her. Moving her things in took 3 hours. Her possessions had been reconstituted, over the months, from almost nothing. A suitcase worth of clothes had become a closet. A borrowed toothbrush had become a bathroom cabinet. None of it was what she'd had in Preston's house, which had been heavy and elaborate, and had never quite felt like hers in the way that a dish towel chosen for oneself in a drugstore on a Tuesday feels like yours. She arranged things on the shelves slowly, trying each position, moving things an inch to the left, an inch to the right, exercising the small authority of a person in their own space. Mia came to the housewarming dinner, and declared the kitchen scientifically promising based on the angle of the afternoon light. She brought a houseplant, chosen herself, that she had researched and identified as basically impossible to kill, which is what you want starting out. Evelyn set it on the eastern windowsill where it would catch the morning sun, and Mia approved. And they ate takeout on the floor of the living room because Evelyn didn't have a table yet. And this felt, against all expectation, like a very complete kind of evening. The legal settlement was concluded in February, largely on terms that Patricia Reeves considered reasonable and Preston Barrett considered humiliating. And Evelyn considered the end of something rather than a victory, which she felt was the right way to hold it. She did not see Preston again after the agreement was signed. She expected to feel more about this than she did. What she felt was mostly the absence of weight. Daniel was still a janitor. He cleaned the warehousing complex on Aldrich Street 4 nights a week, and a medical building on Forest Avenue on the other 3. He was, by the measure of most outward categories, exactly where he had been a year ago. He was also, by his own accounting, entirely somewhere else. He had started, in small increments, to have a life that was not exclusively organized around Mia and the job. He had coffee on Saturday mornings with a colleague named Robert from the Aldrich Street complex, a slow-talking man from somewhere in the South, who had strong opinions about chess and barbecue, and very few opinions about anything else. He had resumed a habit he dropped after Eleanor died running along the river in the early morning. Before Mia woke up, 3 miles and back, the city still dark and cold and entirely his for those 30 minutes. He did not know exactly what these things added up to. Something like the person he was before grief had become a full-time occupation. On the first genuinely warm Saturday of spring, the 3 of them walked to the park near the school, Mia insisting on being between them, holding a hand on each side, with the proprietary satisfaction of a person who has arranged something and is pleased with how it turned out. The trees had their first thin green on them. A man was selling hot dogs from a cart. Somewhere, someone's dog was very happy about something, Mia said, at a certain point. Without particular emphasis. I want to live like this. Daniel and Evelyn both looked at her. Like what? Daniel said. Like this, Mia said, squinting into the light, indicating with a sweep of her free hand the park, the trees, the hot dog cart, the 2 of them. This specific thing. I want this to keep happening. Daniel looked over Mia's head at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking back at him with the expression he'd learned by now, the open one, the undefended one, and she nodded very slightly. Not in commitment exactly. Not in promise, but in the recognition of a true thing said out loud. They walked to the far end of the park, where the river was visible through the trees, a different part of the river than the bridge. Broader here, slower, catching the March light in a way that made it look almost silver rather than dark. Evelyn looked at it without the thing she used to feel looking at water. Just the river in spring, moving steadily in the direction it always moved. Daniel held her hand on the way back. Not dramatically. He just reached over and she let him, and they walked like that through the park, and out onto the street, and down the 4 blocks toward home. The home in question was technically 2 apartments in 2 buildings, which suited them both for now. The question of what came after now was one they had developed a shared approach to. They left it where it was, just outside the range of the present, and attended instead to what was actually in front of them, which was generally enough. This was, Evelyn had decided, a form of wisdom she had come to the slow way through its long absence. You cannot be fully present in a life you are also always fleeing. She was not fleeing now. She was, for the first time in a very long time, simply here. Some people are pulled back from the water, and in the pulling, the one who reaches in is himself, quietly, returned to shore.